Hi, grade 8. This is the review of what we have discussed during the first quarter of our school year. We have discussed two things, force and motion, and the three laws of motion. Force is a push or pull, and it is any interaction that can cause an object to move, accelerate, and change its velocity. While motion is change in place or position over a period of time. Now, what can force do? Force causes motion, force causes change in speed, and force causes change in direction. So, tatlo daw ang pwedeng effect ng force. So, it can cause movement or motion, pwedeng magbago ang bilis, change in speed, and pwede din magbago ang direction. Now, we all know that the unit of force is called Newton, N-E-W-T-O-N, or capital letter N. A Newton is equal to the force that would give a mass of 1 kilogram and acceleration of 1 meter per second squared. Ulit ha, ang Newton daw is equal to the force na kung saan ang 1 kilogram na object ay gagalaw at 1 meter per second squared. Now we have to take note that force is a vector quantity. The sum of all forces is called net force. Now, when an object is not moving, pag hindi daw gumagalaw ang object, hindi ibig sabihin nun ay walang force na nararanasan ng object. It just means that the forces are in opposite directions and equal in strength. Ang ibig sabihin lang daw nun, yung force ay nasa dalawang opposite na directions, pero pantay sila ng ibinibigay na puwersa. Therefore, the force is balanced. Next, when an object is moving, the forces are not equal in magnitude and in size. So, pag hindi naman daw equal and may mas great kesa dun sa isa, that means that the force is unbalanced. Now, the question is, does 0 Newton mean there is no force? No. Hindi ibig sabihin ng 0 Newton ay wala ng force. It just means that the force is balanced. Now, friction is the resistance to motion of one object moving relative to another. It acts on the opposite direction of the normal force. Now, there are two types of friction. The static friction, which keeps a stationary object at rest, and kinetic friction, which is the force that acts between moving surfaces. Again, if the object is at rest, hindi gumagalaw, the friction acting on it is a static friction. While the friction between two moving surfaces is called kinetic friction. Now, to understand further motion, we have discussed Newton's three laws of motion. The first law of motion is law of inertia, which states that an object at rest will stay at rest, or an object in motion will stay in motion and travel in straight line as long as no external net force acts on it. Now, we all know that inertia is the tendency of an object to maintain its initial state of motion. For example, ikaw ay gumagalaw. So, ayaw mong magbago ng posisyon or ng motion, ng movement. Gusto mo gumagalaw ka din. Gumagalaw ka pa rin. So, you have inertia because you don't want to change your movement. Now, sabi nila, inertia is measured by what we call mass, diba? So, a more massive object has more inertia, so it is more difficult to move from rest, slow down, speed up, or change its direction. Again, the bigger the mass of an object, the more inertia it has. Mas mahirap siyang baguhin ng pwesto, pagalawin, ipastop, at magbago ng direction. Now, what do we mean by this law of motion? For example, you are kicking a ball. Sabi dito, an object at rest will remain at rest. Ang bola, if you do not kick it, hindi siya gagalaw. Unless acted upon by an unbalanced force. You kick the ball. Sinipa mo yung bola. Ikaw yung unbalanced force. That's why the object or the ball will fly, right? It will move. It will continue moving unless it's acted again upon by an unbalanced force. For example, pagkasipa mo, nasipa siya sa net. So, hihinto yung bola because it was stopped by the net or an unbalanced force. Next, the second law of motion. The second law of motion talks about the law of acceleration, which says that at a constant force, acceleration is directly proportional to the force and inversely proportional to the mass of the body. When we say directly proportional, ibig sabihin nun, the trend or the change in those two variables are the same. Kunyari, tataas ang isa, tataas din yung isa. While when we say inversely proportional or indirect proportional, it means na pag tumaas yung isang value, ay bababa yung isang value. So in this case, sabi nila, force and mass has direct relationship. Meaning, pag lumaki yung mass, the bigger the mass, the bigger force you need to apply. While force and acceleration, they also have direct relationship. The bigger force that you give, mas malakas yung puwersa, the faster the acceleration of an object. So, lalong bibilis ang paggalaw ng object. While lastly, the relationship naman of mass and acceleration is inversely proportional. Because the bigger the mass, at a constant force, the bigger the mass, the slower would be the acceleration. Now, let's summarize the second law. Force is directly proportional to acceleration. When the mass is the same, the greater the force, the greater the acceleration will be. When the mass and acceleration of an object are given, you can actually compute the amount of force by multiplying mass and acceleration. So the formula for force is force equals mass times acceleration. So for example, to move a 50 kilogram object, pag ang mass daw natin ay 50 kilograms and the acceleration is 10 meters per second squared, the force needed is 50 times 10, 500 newtons. Now, force is also directly proportional to the mass. The more force is needed to move an object with a bigger mass. Mas malaki yung mass, mas madaming force ka dapat na ibigay. For example, you want to move an object at a rate of 5 meters per second square. It will be harder to move 50 kilograms, of course, than a 25 kilogram object. Sabi daw, mas mahirap pagalawin ang 50 kilograms kesa sa 25 kilogram na object. And lastly, the relationship of mass and acceleration is inverse. At a constant force, the bigger the mass, the smaller is the acceleration. Now, deriving the formula F equals m times A, we can infer that mass is equals to force divided by acceleration. Similarly, acceleration can be computed by dividing force with the mass of an object, or A equals F divided by m. Now, the third law of motion, or the law of interaction. It says that for every action, there is an equal and opposite. The statement means that in every interaction, there is a pair of forces acting on the two interacting objects. The size of the force on the first object is equal to the size of the force on the second object. Meanwhile, the direction of the force on the first object is opposite to the direction of the force on the second object. Now, we should remember that forces always come in pairs. Lagi silang magkapares. There is always an equal action and reaction force pair, but they are acting on the opposite direction. Now, to summarize everything that we have learned in first quarter, we know that forces cause motion. And to understand motion, there are three laws. The law of inertia, law of acceleration and interaction. Now, congratulations for finishing first quarter grade 8. I hope you are able to read and answer the summative test. That's 1 to 25. Pero para sa mga estudyanteng hindi nakakapagsagot ng module, kulang ang pinasa, I am requiring you to write 15 keywords that you have learned from this video. Susulat kayo ng 15 keywords na nakuha nyo sa video na ito. Pero kung kayo ay kompleto ng pagsagot, kailangan nyo lang sagutan ang summative test. Okay? Thank you and have a great day.